This thing that we might call the culture wars has been raging for some time now. It's been going on for a lot longer than I've been contributing to them, if that is what I've been doing, since I decided to put aside my disdain for all things social media and add my voice to the melee. When I did start doing this, I was struck by just how much effort and verbiage was being spent on things that, although frivolous on the surface, did challenge some important principles. Microaggressions were one such issue, and the denouncing of them appeared to be one of the more popular anodyne blood sports on offer, from what I came to know as social justice warriors. But it was rather obvious that quite a lot of these people were just flexing their debating muscles. This stuff wasn't really serious. It was mostly about scoring a hit on the opposing side. Numerous YouTube videos were entitled "So and so owns someone else." It always seemed a bit extreme to suggest that someone was owned just by losing an argument, as in the overused word awesome to describe something mildly agreeable or pleasing, rather than actually awe-inspiring. But although quite a lot of this stuff may have seemed crucial, for instance to the transgender person making the point, for the overwhelming majority of the population, misgendering wasn't all that important. What was important though was the pushback. As the SJWs, as they became known, started on their campaign for equality and inclusion, often ironically to the exclusion of all other considerations, more serious commentators began to realise that concepts such as freedom of speech and expression needed defending, lest they be lost forever, all because some oversensitive freak show didn't want their feelings hurt. And standing up for such principles was important work, even if those doing the defending had to defend them against idiots. Arguing with a rational opponent is a skill everyone should acquire. Society will be improved because of it. But arguing with irrational morons is a waste of everybody's time, even theirs. As Douglas Murray has repeatedly pointed out, these are the things that we are going to be arguing about when the barbarians are at the gate. And the barbarians are actually at the gate. They're there now. They may not look like the barbarians we were expecting, but they're there. Instead of the Islamic hordes, we've got self-described grime fan Matt Hancock and the most disappointing Prime Minister in living memory. Instead of us being subjected to the barbarism of Sharia, we have all rolled over to a different, but not that different, flavour of totalitarianism. But there remains a surreal, dreamlike quality to this current oppression. The everyday image of a British town centre remains as much as before, apart from the masks and the boarded up shops, of course. We don't yet look like an oppressed population. People aren't yet being stopped in the street and being asked for their papers. The population doesn't yet automatically understand nor respond to this gesture from a policeman in the way that anyone over the age of 45 from Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, the Balkan countries or any of the republics of the former Soviet Union instinctively remembers. We are not yet used to receiving a knock at the door from the police for the crime of wrongthink, just for placing a sign in your window denouncing the virus as a hoax, although it has happened. And we are not yet used to viewing the police as thugs to be afraid of, since they have the law on their side. Open brutality from the police is not yet the norm, unless of course you go on an anti-lockdown demo, but not, naturally, if you go to a Black Lives Matter one. And even when you're in the thick of it, in the thick of a violent demonstration, and are facing ferried ranks of riot policemen with shields, helmets and batons, and are high on the adrenaline of collective righteous indignation, it still doesn't feel like we are witnessing the dying of a free society. Even when sitting alone in a cell and without the comforting chants of one's comrades outside, which is what one might wishfully have hoped to have been the case before it happened, it still doesn't feel like our freedoms are being removed. It just doesn't feel like it. It all still feels like it's all a game. As I mentioned in a previous video, the desk sergeant at Brixton Police Station was someone who knew his job. And he knew it well. He was there to stabilise and, if necessary, provide some encouragement to the arrested party, to smooth the process as much as possible. Despite my revulsion for the police force generally, there was, I have to admit, a vestige of something to be admired in him. Decency. The fact that I notice it only highlights how rare a thing that is in officialdom in general and the police force in particular. And in that decency, I saw a glimpse of our society that used to be, that I remember. And it's not just nostalgia. I remember my dad telling me about a time when he came out of the pub after an evening's drinking with the cricket team. And as he was about to climb into his Mini for the mile drive home, the local bobby appeared on his bicycle and discouraged him from doing so by suggesting that he, the copper, escort him home, which he did. He didn't nick him, which he could have. Some will say this is just nostalgia and that he should have just arrested him, that he was a dangerous menace. But my parents, like everybody else's parents, drove drunk all the time. My dad always drove to the pub, whereas my mum drove back, since she'd only had about half a dozen vodka and tonics. And me and my sister were in the back, and nobody wore seatbelts. Some people still drove cars that had no seatbelts, let alone airbags or anti-lock brakes. Things were freer then. But there were accidents, horrific ones, I'm sure, since we're only talking about a decade after the high point of deaths on the road in the mid to late 60s. So I suppose there had to be a change. But as with so many things, the safety Nazis just couldn't stop themselves. First it was a 70 mile an hour speed limit, then seatbelts, then anti-drunk driving policies, then motorcycle helmets, and on and on and on until we come to cars that, from 2022, will be electronically incapable of breaking the speed limit. And now, with a multi-pronged attack on drivers, whether it be speed cameras or fines or sleeping policemen, is there any other kind, congestion charging or traffic wardens swirling like sharks, the aim is to make driving so expensive, so rule-bound and with such enormous liabilities, not to mention so thoroughly unpleasant, that everyone will give it up. By then, you might just as well have self-driving cars, for all the pleasure it'll be. Things are, I suppose, safer now. And pleasure is just one of the things that is due to be phased out, along with its more innocent cousin, fun, in the new normal. Because fun is spontaneous, isn't it? And it's unpredictable, not to mention reckless and selfish. And we don't want a spontaneous and unpredictable population. We don't want a unpredictable population. We don't want a free population, because they just do what they want, which means they're a pain in the arse. Why won't they just do what they're told? You let them have cars and they'll just drive around in them. They'll drive them just whenever they feel like it. Selfish bastards that they are. They'll all drive them at the same time, clogging up the roads and spewing carbon dioxide into the air, parking all over the bloody place. Why won't they just get with the programme and get on the bus? At least then they'll free up the roads for us to use. And I know I'll go on about cars and driving a lot, but that's because there is no object on earth that is a more obvious symbol of personal freedom than a car, and perhaps a motorcycle, but you get my point. And that's why they're going after it. Driverless cars are being pushed as an inevitability, and the idea is being sold as a wonderful improvement on the drudgery of driving. Just think, if you didn't have to do all that driving, you could spend more time on your phone. Wouldn't that be brilliant? Rather than look at the boring real world through your windscreen, you could instead look at the virtual world on your smartphone screen. And it seems to me, not just with regard to driving, but with everything else, that the basic autonomy of the individual is under assault. People's natural inclination to do as they please is seen not just by the elites, but by many others as well, to be something that just has to be curtailed. Of course, in any society, there is an amount of give and take that takes place naturally. And when it happens naturally, there is a general agreement on what is within the bounds of acceptable behaviour, and things outside of that are discouraged, frowned upon, and if their effect is sufficiently deleterious to others, laws are made to codify these accepted norms. In the English tradition, this manifests itself in the principle, all is permitted except that which is expressly forbidden. That's the principle. And that which is expressly forbidden tends to be those things that cause harm to others. Murder is the obvious and most egregious example here. The protection of private property is another cornerstone of our society. The idea being that by owning a Ferrari, one is not actually preventing anyone else from also owning one. The principle works fine in that case, when there is, theoretically at least, no limit to the number of Ferraris available. The point being that extravagant luxuries are allowed, no matter how much they might rub others' noses in it. That's tolerance. The issue becomes less clear when one considers the ownership of land or real estate. There is only and will ever be so much land to go round. But despite the accusation from Marxists that all property is theft, the principle still holds. But my suspicion that the very idea of private property for the lower orders is increasingly being seen as an indulgent anachronism. By the elites, of course. My idea of a healthy society is to have a patrician upper class that looks after those valuable things like country houses that benefit from being passed down the generations, an affluent middle class that drives the upper end of the consumer economy, and an aspirational working class that has a path to climb the social ladder. But the Davos set don't see it like that. They view the masses, which in their worldview very much includes the middle class, as unmanageable, profligate and far too attached, not only to their material possessions, but also to outdated ideas of freedom and individuality. And that, in my view, is a distinctly indecent view of other human beings. The decency I spoke of above by that police desk sergeant of all people was the implication that I was not an enemy, but merely an individual citizen who disagreed with them. That is the correct and decent way to view other human beings. But some, the elites it seems, have grown weary of treating the rest of humanity with any kind of decency. They seem to view us as an irritating, unhygienic and possibly diseased pathogen at best, and as dangerous vermin at worst. But like I say, despite the general, gradual and relentless erosion of our freedom of the road, which has now rather suddenly been extended to all areas of life, the feeling remains that it is all an elaborate game. In fact, that feeling often makes me feel somewhat self-conscious when talking about such concepts as freedom, sovereignty, or even patriotism. It feels as if I'm being over-earnest, that I'm some kind of pathetic middle-aged revolutionary 30 years too late to be playing the rebel. And that's part of the reason that I try and keep my YouTube and my real life separate. But sometimes the two will collide when I reveal my opinions to my friends. Two of my friends I know believe me to have fallen under the spell of the tinfoil hat brigade, whilst another believes me somewhat naive in believing any of the mainstream narrative. But what if I'm wrong? What if my maskless protest really is putting others at risk? What if my actions really are delaying a return to normal life? What if we never get back to normal because of my actions and my encouragement to others to do the same? How can I be sure? The truth is, I can't be sure. I have tried to sift through the evidence, but the scientific consensus is against me. But then that is what I would expect. The truth is no more the truth, just because the majority of people believe it. And into the mix one has to look behind the consensus, even to decide whether one can believe the experts. Following the science is all very well, but when one of the chief scientists turns out to have 650,000 quid's worth of shares in GlaxoSmithKline, and is likely to become a millionaire many, many times over if they get to supply the much vaunted vaccine, how on earth can you trust that? A more pertinent question is my position, and those who agree with me, likely to do the most amount of good if I stick to it, or if I abandon it? But even that is not a straightforward calculation. It depends on what is most important. Is safety more important, or freedom? For me, that's easy. I'll take a free but more dangerous world every single time. But for others, the opposite is true. And it's easy to sneer at them. It's easy. It's easy to view them as trembling cowards. In fact, it's difficult not to view them like that. And it's easier to view them with contempt, because their fear really is likely to remove my freedom. So what's the opposite of that? Is my, I won't say courage because it's not that, but is my acceptance of risk really putting them in danger? Well, potentially yes, it is. I'm quite open about that. I do expect them to accept the same risk as I do. For me, that's just being free. That's just normal human agency. Because what's the alternative? In order to be safe, one necessarily has to accept the control of those doing the protecting. That's the deal. That's always the deal. But I do expect my fellow citizens to accept the burden of being free. Because freedom itself isn't free. Freedom comes with its own burden. But that burden is, as far as I'm concerned, is far less burdensome than the burden of control by others. So I do not expect them to cower in fear. I expect them to be worthy of those that came before. I expect them to be prepared, at least in principle, to make sacrifices. Sacrifices that at least go some way of honouring the sacrifices made by those who came before us. To cower in fear by relinquishing hard-won freedoms for the promise of protection is to gravely insult them, particularly and especially if you piously attend the laying of wreaths on Remembrance Sunday. That's the moral equivalent of nicking the medals off a real veteran, pinning them on your own chest, and then taking a shit on a war memorial. But the time is coming, and it really has to be the case this time, that it will cease to feel like a game. I ran the gauntlet of going to London on the train again last weekend, but it's getting more fraught every time. I'm beginning to wait for times when the guards aren't watching, rather than going in and willing them to stop me. And everybody else is wearing a mask. I still won't, but I try not to get into other people's faces about it. After all, it is supposed to be spread by droplets. So what will be the result if we abandon our objections to the wearing of masks, accept the lockdowns and support the government wholeheartedly? What will that accomplish? Will it hasten the day that we come out of this and back to the old normal of our relatively free society? Will it? It might, but it's no more likely than not. Powers once taken, or even given away, are never returned willingly. What is more likely, in my opinion, is that our compliance will just be viewed as a sign of our compliance. Well, they'll reason, since they agree to the wearing of masks indoors, they'll probably agree to wearing them everywhere. Since they've allowed us to tell them what they must wear, they'll probably allow us to tell them where they can go, what time they can go, and what time they can't. The likelihood is that they'll allow us to tell them who they can see. By then, they'll probably allow us to tell them what books they can read, what films they can watch, and even who they can vote for. For governments who want to control their populations, and all governments do want to control their populations, it's far better to get consent for the removal of freedoms rather than taking them by force. Partly because of the optics, but also because once a freedom is willingly being surrendered, those doing the surrendering, like all people, will not want to admit that they have made a mistake. So they will rationalise it. They'll say it was to protect the NHS. They'll say it was for the common good. They'll say it's just temporary. And then they'll get used to it. And then they'll forget. And then it will become the norm. And then they won't, out of shame, tell the young what they have done. And so the young will never know how it was before. Just like the young of today, who have no real concept of anonymity or privacy, even though it was, at one time, highly valued. And once it's gone, as privacy and anonymity very, very nearly have, now that we are watched by CCTV, ANPR, facial recognition, and now track and trace, those who did the surrendering now pretend that it's really not so bad. What do I care, they'll say. What do I care if they watch me, as I haven't done anything wrong? And then, not only will they accept it, that they are now not citizens to be respected, but merely rats in a maze, watched constantly and unblinkingly by the surveillance state for the second they step out of line, they will attempt to soothe their troubled consciences by implying that those that do not accept that fate and might like to keep their private lives private are in some way selfish, or that they might have some dirty little secret. A secret that those that have sold out their own children's chance of a private life away from the prying eyes of government will then be desperate to expose. They are the ones that will report on their neighbours breaking the rule of 6. And we will forever be looking over our shoulders and wondering, was it you? And the snitches will inherit the earth. That's the new normal. And that's why I won't be wearing a mask. Despite how it might feel. This isn't a game.